They loaded Lydia Hart onto that wagon like cargo nobody wanted to claim. A barren widow, 26 years old, being shipped to a man so broken the town had stopped saying his name out loud. Cedar Ridge called it charity. Lydia called it exile. She didn't cry, didn't beg. She just gripped the side of that wagon and made herself a promise. Wherever they were sending her, she'd survive it. Because spite, she'd learned, lasts longer than shame. If you want to see how a woman the world threw away built a family that couldn't be broken, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far Lydia's story can travel. The wagon jolted over another rut, and Lydia Hart's spine slammed against the wooden slat behind her. She didn't make a sound. She'd learned over the past 3 years that silence was the only dignity left to a woman like her, a woman whose womb had failed, whose husband had died young, and whose presence had become an embarrassment Cedar Ridge no longer knew how to ignore. Martha Kinsley sat across from her, hands folded primly over her Bible, mouth pressed into a line that suggested she was doing the Lord's work and finding it distasteful. Next to Martha, Reverend Dodd gripped the wagon's side, his face pale green from the motion. Neither had spoken to Lydia in over an hour. They'd said everything that mattered back in town, in Martha's parlor, with the other women of the benevolence committee watching like crows on a fence. It's for the best, Lydia. A fresh start. Mr. Rourke needs help on his ranch, and you need a place. Translation. You're a problem we're solving. A cautionary tale we're shipping 20 miles away so we don't have to look at it anymore. Lydia's hands tightened on the small carpet bag in her lap, everything she owned in the world, minus the furniture she'd sold to pay for Thomas's headstone. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been married 3 years, widowed for 2, and now she was being sent to another man's house like a piece of furniture herself. Functional, necessary, replaceable. The Wyoming landscape rolled past, endless and indifferent. June heat shimmered off the grassland, turning the horizon into a mirage. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills that looked like sleeping animals, was Caleb Rourke's ranch. Lydia knew almost nothing about the man except what whispers had taught her. Widower, recluse, someone who'd lost his family and his faith in the same brutal winter 5 years back. Someone who hadn't been to town since. Someone, apparently, desperate enough to accept Cedar Ridge's cast-off. "We'll be there within the hour," Reverend Dodd said suddenly, his voice tight. He pulled out a handkerchief and mopped his forehead. "I trust you understand the arrangement, Mrs. Hart." Lydia looked at him steadily. "You've made it clear, Reverend. I'm to keep house. Nothing more." Martha's mouth twitched. "It's a Christian solution to a difficult situation. Mr. Rourke requires domestic help. You require a roof and respectability. The union serves both." Union. As if this were a marriage instead of a transaction. As if Lydia had any choice in the matter. She'd tried to refuse 2 weeks ago, when Martha had first proposed the idea. She'd stood in that parlor and said she'd find work, that she didn't need their help, that she could manage on her own. The women had exchanged glances, pitying, dismissive. Then Martha had leaned forward, voice dropping to something almost kind. "Lydia, dear, there is no work. Not for you, not anymore. People talk, they remember, and a woman alone with your history. It's simply not proper." What Martha meant, what they all meant, was simple. Lydia was damaged goods, a wife who couldn't give her husband children, a woman whose body had failed at its only sacred purpose. Thomas had been kind about it, gentle even, but she'd seen the disappointment in his eyes every month, the way hope bled out of him a little more each time. And then he'd caught pneumonia during a late October storm, and within a week he was gone, and Lydia was left with nothing but debt, whispers, and the suffocating weight of other people's pity. Cedar Ridge didn't know what to do with her, so they'd found someone who might. The wagon crested a hill, and Lydia's breath caught despite herself. The valley below was a surprise, green where the surrounding land was brown, carved by a creek that glinted silver in the afternoon sun. Cottonwoods clustered along the water, their leaves shimmering. And there, set back from the creek, was the ranch. It wasn't what Lydia had expected. She'd imagined something broken, neglected, a reflection of the man who lived there. Instead, she saw a sturdy log house with a stone chimney, a barn that looked weathered but sound, corrals that held a few horses and some cattle. The place had bones, good bones. But there was something off about it too, something she couldn't name at first. Then she realized no smoke from the chimney, even though it was near supper time. No laundry on the line, no garden that she could see, no sign of life except the animals. It looked like a place where someone was surviving, not living. Martha cleared her throat. Well, it's more substantial than I expected. The wagon rolled down the slope, wheels crunching over stone and dry grass. As they approached, a figure emerged from the barn, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate care of a man who'd learned not to hurry. He wore a dusty shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark trousers, a hat pulled low against the sun. He stopped near the porch and waited, arms crossed, as the wagon pulled up. Reverend Dodd climbed down first, wobbling slightly. Mr. Rourke, good afternoon. The man nodded, said nothing. Lydia studied him from her seat in the wagon. Caleb Rourke looked to be in his mid-30s, weathered by sun and work, with a beard that was more neglect than fashion. His eyes, shadowed under the brim of his hat, were the color of winter sky, pale, cold, unreadable. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Martha descended next, smoothing her skirts. We've brought Mrs. Hart, as agreed. I trust you've prepared appropriate accommodations? She'll have the spare room, Caleb said. His voice was rough, underused. It's clean. And the arrangements? Martha pressed. You understand this is a household position, Mr. Rourke. Mrs. Hart is here to provide domestic services in exchange for room, board, and a modest wage. Nothing more. Something flickered in Caleb's expression. Amusement, maybe, or contempt. I understand, Mrs. Kinsley. I'm not looking for a wife. The words landed like a slap. Lydia felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her face smooth, her eyes forward. Of course he wasn't. Why would he be? She was the woman nobody wanted, being delivered to the man nobody talked to. A perfect match. Excellent, Martha said briskly. Then we'll leave you to it. Mrs. Hart, if you'll... I can manage. Lydia stood, gripping the wagon's side, and climbed down without help. Her legs were stiff from the journey, but she locked her knees and faced Caleb Rourke directly. Mr. Rourke? He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed across his face too quickly to read. Then he nodded once. Ma'am. Reverend Dodd retrieved her carpet bag from the wagon bed and set it on the ground with obvious relief. Well, I believe our business here is concluded. Mrs. Hart, you know the terms. Mr. Rourke has agreed to provide you with $5 a month in addition to room and board. Should the arrangement prove unsatisfactory, you may send word to town, and we'll make other provisions. Other provisions. Lydia almost laughed. There were no other provisions. This was the end of the road. Thank you, Reverend, she said quietly. Mrs. Kinsley. Martha hesitated, then reached out and briefly touched Lydia's arm. It was the first kind gesture she'd made all day. Do try, dear, for your own sake. Then they were climbing back into the wagon, turning the horses, rolling away across the valley. Lydia watched until they crested the hill and disappeared, taking with them the last thread connecting her to the life she'd known. When she turned back, Caleb was still standing there, silent as stone. The afternoon stretched between them, awkward and uncertain. Your room's inside, Caleb said finally. Second door on the left, kitchen's through the main room. There's a well out back, privy past the barn. Chickens need feeding at sundown, if you're up to it. Lydia picked up her carpet bag. I'm up to it. He nodded again, then turned and walked toward the barn without another word. Lydia watched him go, something twisting in her chest. Not quite anger, not quite hurt. Just a dull recognition of what her life had become. She carried her bag to the porch, pushed open the door, and stepped into Caleb Rourke's house. The main room was larger than she expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a rough-hewn table and chairs near the kitchen area, and a few pieces of simple furniture arranged with no regard for comfort or appearance. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. The floor needed sweeping, the windows needed washing. The whole place had the hollow feel of a space where someone existed but didn't live. Lydia walked through to the kitchen. Dishes were stacked haphazardly in a dry sink. The stove was cold, the counter cluttered with the remnants of meals eaten alone and joylessly. A tin of coffee sat open, ground scattered around it. She ran her finger along the table's edge, and it came away gray. So this was it. This was the fresh start Cedar Ridge had arranged for her. A lonely man's dusty house, 20 miles from anywhere, where she'd cook and clean and fade into the same kind of half-life Thomas's death had left her in. Lydia set her bag down and pressed her palms flat against the table. Her throat was tight, her eyes burning, but she didn't cry. She'd cried herself empty in the months after Thomas died, and it had changed nothing. The world didn't care about her tears. It only cared whether she could make herself useful. Fine, she could do that. She'd been doing it her whole life. She found the spare room exactly where Caleb had said, small, plain, but blessedly clean. A narrow bed with a quilt that had seen better days, a chest of drawers, a single window looking out toward the creek. Lydia unpacked her few belongings methodically. 2 dresses, a nightgown, undergarments, a brush. The small daguerreotype of Thomas she'd almost left behind but couldn't quite abandon. She set it on the chest, face down, then sat on the bed and let herself feel the full weight of the day. Outside, she could hear Caleb moving around the barn, the low murmur of his voice to the horses, the scrape of a shovel, the creak of wood. Ordinary sounds. A life continuing, indifferent to her arrival. Lydia stood, smoothed her dress, and went back to the kitchen. If she was going to be here, she might as well start. She lit the stove, found a kettle, and filled it from the pump outside, set water to boil. Then she rolled up her sleeves and began to clean. She washed the dishes first, scrubbing away the remnants of bachelor meals. Then she wiped down the counters, the table, the stove. She found a broom in the corner and swept the floors, raising clouds of dust that made her cough. She washed the windows until light streamed through them properly. She organized the dry goods on the shelf, consolidated half-empty tins, threw out things that had gone bad. By the time the sun started sinking toward the hills, the kitchen looked like a place where someone might actually want to eat a meal. Lydia found eggs, a bit of salt pork, some wizened potatoes. She fried the pork, scrambled the eggs, boiled the potatoes, and mashed them with a pat of butter she discovered wrapped in cloth in the cold box. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, and it was real. And when she set the table with 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 cups of coffee, it almost looked like something normal. She stepped onto the porch just as Caleb was crossing from the barn. He stopped when he saw her, surprise clear on his face. "Supper's ready," Lydia said. "If you're hungry." He stood there for a long moment, and Lydia saw something crack in his expression, some barrier he'd been holding against the world. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll wash up." He disappeared around the side of the house. Lydia went back inside and stood by the table, hands clasped, heart hammering for no reason she could name. This was just a meal, just 2 people eating at the end of a long day, nothing more. But when Caleb came in, hat in his hands, damp hair pushed back from his forehead, and stopped in the doorway to stare at the clean kitchen, the set table, the steam rising from the plates, Lydia saw something she hadn't expected. Grief. Raw and naked and so huge she almost looked away. "It's nothing fancy," she said quietly. Caleb's jaw worked. He crossed to the table, pulled out a chair, sat down like a man being careful not to break something fragile. "It's more than I've had in a long while." They ate in silence. Lydia kept her eyes on her plate, aware of every sound, the scrape of his fork, the way he paused after each bite as if relearning the pleasure of a decent meal. When he finished, he set his fork down and looked at her directly for the first time. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," Lydia said, "but I'm here now. Might as well make myself useful." Something shifted in his expression. "They told you why I needed help?" "They told me you were a widower, that you kept to yourself, that you needed someone to manage the house." She met his gaze steadily. "They didn't tell me much else." "Good." Caleb stood, carried his plate to the sink. "Because there's not much else to tell. I've got a ranch to run, and I don't have time to do both. You keep the house, cook the meals, tend the chickens and the garden if you've a mind to start one. I'll handle the rest. We'll stay out of each other's way." It was a speech he'd prepared, Lydia realized, a boundary he was drawing in the dust. "All right," she said. He nodded, retrieved his hat, and headed for the door. Then he paused, hand on the frame. "The room. It's all right?" It's fine. Good. He stepped out into the gathering dusk, then stopped again. Without turning around, he said, "Thank you. For supper." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading toward the barn. Lydia sat alone at the table, surrounded by the ghosts of her own failures and the echoes of someone else's grief, and tried to imagine how she was going to survive this strange new exile. She washed the dishes, banked the fire, and retreated to her small room as the last light bled from the sky. She lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds, coyotes yipping in the distance, the wind moving through the cottonwoods, the restless stamping of horses in the barn. Somewhere in the darkness, Caleb Rourke was also lying awake, she suspected. Two broken people, strangers, trapped together by circumstance and desperation. Lydia closed her eyes and tried not to think about the years stretching ahead, empty and identical, in this house that felt like a tomb. The next morning, Lydia woke before dawn. Old habits from her marriage to Thomas: rise early, start the fire, make coffee, begin the day before the day began you. She dressed in the dim light, pinned up her hair, and made her way to the kitchen. Caleb was already there. He stood by the stove, trying to coax a flame from damp kindling, his movements awkward and impatient. He looked up when she entered, startled, then stepped back. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." Lydia moved to the stove, assessed the situation, and began rearranging the wood with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, flames were crackling. "Coffee? I can make it." "I'm sure you can, but I'm here now." She measured grounds into the pot, added water, set it on the heat. "How do you take it?" "Black." Of course he did. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen, the morning light just beginning to pearl the windows, and Lydia felt the strangeness of it all over again. Yesterday she'd been in Cedar Ridge, surrounded by people who pitied her. Today she was in a stranger's house, making his coffee, waiting for her life to make sense. "I'll be out most of the day," Caleb said abruptly. "Got fence line to check in the north pasture. There's bread and cheese if you need a meal." "I'll manage." Lydia poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed him one. "The chickens. Where should I look for eggs?" "Coop's behind the barn. They're not laying much. Haven't been tended regular." "I'll see to it." He nodded, drank his coffee in 3 long swallows, set the cup down with a decisive thunk. "Right. Well." Then he was gone, boots heavy on the porch, the door swinging shut behind him. Lydia finished her own coffee slowly, then began her day. She made a thorough inspection of the house, cataloging what needed attention. The spare bedroom, her bedroom now, was fine. But the main bedroom, the one Caleb clearly used, was a disaster. She stood in the doorway, debating. This felt like crossing a line. But the floor was covered in tracked-in mud, the bed linens were gray with age, and the whole room smelled of old sweat and resignation. She'd come here to keep house, so she'd keep house. She stripped the bed, carried the linens outside to soak in a wash tub, swept and mopped the floor. She didn't touch his personal things, the items on the dresser, the coat hanging on a peg, but she made the space clean and breathable. Then she moved on to the main room, the kitchen, the porch. She worked steadily, methodically, letting the rhythm of labor quiet the chaos in her mind. By mid-afternoon, she'd found the chicken coop. It was a sorry sight. The door hung crooked, the nesting boxes were filthy, and the chickens themselves looked scrawny and mean. But she'd grown up on a farm, back before she'd married Thomas and moved to town. She knew how to handle chickens. She cleaned the coop, repaired the door with a hammer and some nails she found in the barn, spread fresh straw in the nesting boxes. The chickens watched her with suspicious eyes, but when she scattered feed, they descended on it like they were starving. "We'll get you sorted," Lydia told them. "Both of us could use some sorting." By the time Caleb returned, the sun was slanting low and golden across the valley. Lydia was on the porch, snapping beans she'd discovered in a pathetic little plot behind the house. Barely a garden, more like a memory of one. She looked up as he dismounted, and their eyes met. He stared at the porch, at the swept floor, at the windows that now sparkled, at her sitting there with beans in her lap like she'd been doing it for years. "You've been busy," he said finally. "That's what I'm here for." He tied his horse to the rail, climbed the steps, and stood looking down at her. Up close, she could see the fatigue carved into his face, the way his shoulders held tension like a yoke. You didn't have to do my room. It needed doing. Still, it's my space. Lydia set the bowl aside and stood, meeting his gaze levelly. Mr. Rourke, I'm here to keep your house. That includes all of it. If you want me to stay out of certain places, you need to say so clearly. Otherwise, I'm going to do my job. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe respect. Then he nodded slowly. Fair enough. And it's Caleb. No need for formality. Lydia, she said. Lydia. He tried the name out, awkward in his mouth. Then he gestured to the beans. I forgot those were even out there. They're half dead, but I think I can bring them back. The chickens are in better shape now, too. They should start laying regular if they're fed and tended. Caleb shook his head, something like wonder in his expression. You've been here one day. I've had practice making the best of bad situations. The words came out harder than she intended, and she saw him flinch. But he didn't apologize, didn't offer empty comfort. He just nodded again, slower this time, like he understood. I'll wash up, he said. If there's supper, there will be. Boy. The days found a rhythm. Caleb left at dawn, worked the ranch until dark. Lydia cleaned, cooked, tended the chickens, nursed the struggling garden back to life. They spoke rarely, sharing meals in near silence, existing in separate spheres that happened to overlap in the same physical space. But slowly, incrementally, things began to change. Lydia noticed it first in small ways. Caleb started leaving his muddy boots on the porch instead of tracking dirt through the house. He began washing his own dishes when he came in late. Once, she found a stack of firewood by the kitchen door that she hadn't split. He'd done it without being asked, without expecting thanks. And the house itself responded to her care. The windows gleamed, the floors shone. The kitchen smelled of bread and herbs instead of stale coffee and resignation. The garden, given water and attention, began to flourish. Beans climbed their poles, tomatoes swelled on the vine, squash sprawled across the earth like green promises. 2 weeks in, Lydia was hanging laundry when Caleb rode up mid-morning, which was unusual. He dismounted, walked over to where she stood with a basket of wet sheets. Need to go into town tomorrow, he said. Pick up supplies. Thought you might want to come, if there's anything you need. Lydia's hands stilled on the clothesline. The thought of seeing Cedar Ridge again, of facing Martha Kinsley and the other women, of enduring their questions and their pity, it made her stomach clench. But she did need things. Fabric for new curtains, seeds for the garden, flour, sugar, salt. All right, she said. The next morning they set out in the wagon, the silence between them heavy with all the things they hadn't said. Lydia wore her better dress, pinned her hair carefully, and told herself she could endure a few hours in town. She'd endured worse. Cedar Ridge looked exactly the same dusty main street, the same cluster of buildings, the same people moving through their daily routines with comfortable certainty. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of Morrison's general store, helped Lydia down with surprising courtesy, then immediately headed for the hardware section. Lydia gathered her supplies quickly, aware of eyes tracking her movement. She was at the fabric counter when Martha Kinsley appeared at her elbow. Lydia, what a surprise! Martha's smile was bright and false. How are you finding life at the Rourke Ranch? It's fine, thank you. And Mr. Rourke? Is he treating you well? Lydia met her gaze directly. He's been perfectly appropriate, if that's what you're asking. Martha had the grace to look embarrassed. Of course, I only meant, well, you know how people worry. People. As if Martha weren't the chief gossip in 3 counties. There's nothing to worry about, Lydia said firmly. I'm keeping house. He's running the ranch. It's exactly what was arranged. Good. That's very good. Martha hesitated. You look well. Better than, that is, the ranch seems to agree with you. Lydia realized with some shock that it was true. The constant work, the physical labor, the sheer exhaustion of making that house livable, it had given her something Cedar Ridge never had. Purpose without pity. Value without shame. It does, she said quietly. She finished her shopping and found Caleb waiting by the wagon, loading sacks of feed. He glanced at her packages. Get everything? Yes. Good. Let's go. They were nearly out of town when someone called Caleb's name. A man jogged up to the wagon, tall, friendly-faced, younger than Caleb by a decade. Caleb Rourke. Damn. Haven't seen you in ages. Caleb's expression shuddered. Ben, heard you had someone helping out at the ranch now. Ben's eyes shifted to Lydia with frank curiosity. Ma'am? This is Mrs. Hart, Caleb said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. She's my housekeeper. Something passed across Ben's face. Understanding, maybe sympathy. Well, it's good you've got help. Place that size, it's too much for one person. He stepped back. You ever need a hand with anything, you know where to find me. Caleb nodded curtly, snapped the reins, and they rolled forward. They were a mile out of town before Lydia spoke. Who was that? Ben Farrow. Used to work for me before... Caleb stopped. Long time ago. Before his family died. Before he became the man no one talked to. Lydia didn't push. She understood about befores, about the lives that ended and left you stranded in an after you never chose. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it felt different somehow. Less like strangers trapped together, more like two people who'd agreed to leave certain ghosts undisturbed. A month passed, then another. Summer deepened, the days long and hot, the work constant but satisfying. Lydia fell into the rhythm of ranch life, feeding chickens, tending the garden, cooking meals that Caleb ate with a gratitude he never quite voiced, but that showed in the way he'd linger at the table, the way he'd sometimes ask if there was more. She learned his habits. He woke before dawn, worked until exhaustion forced him to stop. He spoke little but listened carefully. He was meticulous with the animals, gentle with the horses, fair in his dealings. He never raised his voice, never showed anger, but sometimes she'd catch him staring at nothing with an expression of such profound loneliness it made her chest ache. And slowly, cautiously, they began to talk. It started small. Caleb asking if the chickens were laying better. Lydia mentioning a fence that needed mending near the garden. Practical exchanges that gradually expanded into something more. One evening, Lydia was kneading bread when Caleb came in and lingered by the table instead of disappearing to wash up. Garden's looking good, he said. Thank you. I'll have squash coming in soon, and the beans are thriving. You grew up on a farm? Lydia nodded, surprised by the question. In Kansas. My father had a small place, nothing like this, but enough to keep us fed. You miss it? She considered. I miss knowing what I was good at. Before I married Thomas, I knew how to work, how to make things grow after... She trailed off. After you were just a wife, Caleb finished quietly. Yes. She shaped the dough, folded it, and then not even that. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I had a wife, Sarah, and a son, Daniel. He was 4. Lydia's hand stilled. This was the first time he'd spoken their names. There was a winter storm, Caleb continued, his voice flat, reciting facts to keep emotion at bay. Sarah took the wagon into town for supplies. Thought she'd make it back before the weather turned. She didn't. They found them 3 days later, frozen. I'm sorry, Lydia whispered. Everyone's sorry. Doesn't change anything. He turned toward the door. I'll wash up. But he'd shared it, given her that piece of himself. And Lydia understood it for what it was. A tentative trust. An acknowledgement that they were both survivors of losses that had redefined them. The next day, she made Daniel's favorite meal. Caleb had mentioned it once, in passing, and said nothing when his eyes grew bright with unshed tears. By late summer, the ranch had transformed. The garden was lush and productive. The chicken coop was repaired and expanded, the hens fat and content. The house gleamed with care, smelled of cooking and cleaning instead of dust and defeat. Lydia had even started making curtains, softening the harsh edges of the windows. And Caleb had changed too. He smiled occasionally, small, cautious expressions, but real. He'd started talking more, sharing bits of his day, asking about hers. Once he'd brought her wildflowers from the north pasture, mumbling something about how they matched the new curtains. They'd become something Lydia hadn't expected, partners. Not in the way the town had feared or hoped, but in the daily work of making a life function. They fell into an easy teamwork. Caleb would milk the cow in the morning while Lydia started breakfast. She'd gather eggs while he fed the horses. They'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the light fade, comfortable in shared silence. It wasn't love. Neither of them was ready for that. Might never be. But it was something solid and real, something that felt less like exile and more like survival. Then September came, and with it, the storm that would change everything. The sky had been threatening all day, heavy clouds rolling in from the west, turning the afternoon light strange and green. Lydia watched from the kitchen window as she worked, kneading dough for the evening meal, aware of the pressure building in the air. The chickens had gone quiet hours ago, huddled in their coop. The horses shifted restlessly in the corral. Caleb came in earlier than usual, his face tight with concern. "Storm's coming. Bad one, I think. I need to get the cattle closer to the barn, make sure everything's secured. What can I do?" He paused, clearly unused to the offer. "Windows need shuttering. There's boards in the barn and nails and hammer on the workbench. And fill every bucket and barrel we have with water from the well. If this turns into what I think it will, we'll want reserves." Lydia wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll start now." They worked in tandem, racing against the darkening sky. Caleb rode out to gather the cattle while Lydia hauled water, her arms aching with the weight of full buckets. She found the boards he'd mentioned and began securing the windows, the wind picking up with each passing minute, whipping her skirts around her legs. By the time Caleb returned, driving a dozen head of cattle into the near pasture, the first fat drops of rain were falling. "That's all I could find," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Rest are scattered too far. They'll have to weather it on their own." Thunder cracked overhead, so loud Lydia flinched. The rain intensified suddenly, going from scattered drops to a torrential downpour in seconds. They ran for the house, Caleb grabbing her elbow to steady her on the slick porch steps. Inside, they stood dripping on the clean floor Lydia had scrubbed just that morning, breathing hard. Rain hammered the roof like fists demanding entry. Wind screamed around the corners of the house, testing the shutters. "I've seen storms," Caleb said quietly, staring at the door. "But this feels different." Lydia felt it too, something wild and dangerous in the air, something that made her skin prickle with primitive warning. "How long do you think it'll last?" "Hours? Maybe through the night." He moved to the fireplace, began building up the fire. "We should eat while we can. If the chimney starts smoking or the roof starts leaking, we'll need our strength." They ate cold bread and cheese, neither of them hungry but both understanding the necessity. The storm raged around them, rattling the shutters, moaning through gaps they hadn't known existed. Lydia had lived through prairie storms in Kansas, had seen tornadoes touch down and tear the world apart, but this felt more personal somehow, as if the weather itself were angry at their small attempt at peace. Darkness fell early, swallowed by the storm. Caleb lit lamps, checked the shutters again, paced like a caged animal. Lydia tried to work on her sewing but gave it up, her nerves too frayed to focus. They sat on opposite sides of the fireplace, listening to the violence outside. "Sarah died in a storm," Caleb said suddenly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Not like this. Snow. But I keep thinking, if I'd told her not to go, if I'd insisted we had enough supplies, if I'd—" "You can't do that to yourself," Lydia interrupted gently. "I spent 2 years wondering if Thomas would have lived if I'd called the doctor sooner, if I'd noticed the symptoms earlier, if I'd been a better wife and given him children so he'd have had more reason to fight." She met Caleb's eyes across the firelight. "It doesn't change anything. They're still gone." "How do you live with it?" "I don't know that I do. I just keep moving, keep working, try to find something that makes the days bearable." She gestured around them. "This place, it's helped. Having purpose again." Caleb nodded slowly. "You've made a difference here. More than you know." Before Lydia could respond, a sound cut through the storm, faint but distinct. A human voice calling out. They both froze. Caleb was on his feet instantly, crossing to the door. "Did you hear?" "Yes." Lydia stood, her heart hammering. "Someone's out there." Caleb grabbed a lantern, threw open the door. Wind and rain exploded into the house, nearly knocking him backward. He held the lantern high, peering into the storm. Hello? Anyone there? The voice came again, closer now, desperate. Then shapes emerged from the darkness. Two men supporting a third between them, all of them soaked and stumbling. Behind them came a woman clutching two small children and an older man limping badly. Please, one of the men shouted over the wind. Our wagon overturned half a mile back. We need shelter. Caleb didn't hesitate. Get inside, quickly. They stumbled in, a chaos of wet bodies and frightened voices. Lydia counted 7 in total as Caleb shut the door against the storm. 2 men in their 30s, both strong-built but clearly exhausted. The injured man they'd been supporting, his leg bent at a wrong angle. A woman perhaps Lydia's age, her dress torn and muddy, clutching a boy of about 6 and a girl no more than 4. And the older man, white-haired and dignified despite the blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. Jesus, Caleb breathed, taking in the extent of their distress. Lydia, get blankets, clean cloth for bandages, whatever food's ready. Lydia was already moving. She stripped the beds, gathered every blanket and quilt in the house, then rushed to the kitchen to put water on to boil. Behind her, she heard Caleb organizing the chaos with quiet authority. You two help your friend to the chair by the fire. Easy now, that leg's broken. Ma'am, bring the children over here where it's warm. Sir, let me see that cut. By the time Lydia returned with blankets, Caleb had the injured man seated and was examining his leg with careful hands. The man was conscious but gray with pain, his teeth gritted. It's a clean break, Caleb said. I can set it, but it's going to hurt. Do what you need to do, the man gasped. Lydia distributed blankets, then knelt beside the woman and children. Up close, she could see the woman was trembling violently, whether from cold or shock or both. The children clung to her, their eyes huge with fear. You're safe now, Lydia said softly. Let's get you out of these wet clothes. What are your names? I'm Margaret, the woman whispered. This is Tommy and little Beth. That's my husband James, the one with the broken leg. The others are travelers we picked up in the last town. They needed a ride west. Well, you're all welcome here. Come with me. I have a dry nightgown you can wear, and I'll find something for the children. She led Margaret and the children to her room, helped them change into dry clothes that hung comically large on their small frames. Through the door, she could hear Caleb working on James's leg, the man's strangled cries making her wince. Then silence, and Caleb's low voice. It's set. Try not to move it. When Lydia emerged with Margaret and the children, the main room had transformed into a makeshift infirmary. James sat by the fire, his legs splinted with strips of wood and bound with torn sheets, his face sheened with sweat. The older man, who introduced himself as Mr. Garrett, had a bandage wrapped around his head. The 2 younger men, brothers named Samuel and David, stood near the door looking sheepish and grateful. I've got stew from yesterday, Lydia announced. It'll take a few minutes to heat through, but everyone needs to eat. She worked quickly, heating the stew, slicing bread, pouring coffee. Caleb helped her distribute the food, and for a few minutes the only sounds were the storm outside and the grateful quiet of people eating. Margaret's children fell asleep almost immediately after eating, curled together like puppies near the hearth. Margaret herself looked ready to collapse. You should rest, Lydia told her. Take my bed. I'll watch the children. I couldn't. You can and you will. Your husband needs you strong in the morning, not sick from exhaustion. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't found you. After Margaret had been settled, Lydia returned to find Caleb standing with the 2 brothers and Mr. Garrett, their voices low. Storm like this could last all night, Mr. Garrett was saying. Maybe into tomorrow. We're grateful for the shelter, Mr. Rourke, but we don't want to impose. You'll stay as long as the storm lasts, Caleb said firmly. After that, we'll see about getting your wagon upright and your group on your way. For now, rest. You can bed down here by the fire. There's more blankets if you need them. The men settled in, and gradually the house grew quiet except for the storm's fury. Lydia sat in a chair near the children, watching their small faces in the firelight. Caleb stood by the window, peering through a gap in the shutters at the chaos outside. You were good with them, Lydia said softly. Setting that leg, organizing everyone. Used to have to do it sometimes. Back when I had hired hands, someone was always getting hurt. He turned from the window. You were good with the woman and children. I know what it's like to be terrified and displaced. Caleb crossed to where she sat, lowered himself into the chair beside her. They sat in silence, watching the sleeping children, listening to the storm. Thank you, Caleb said finally, for helping, for not hesitating. They needed help. We had room. Lydia glanced at him. Isn't that what people are supposed to do? Should be. Often isn't. His voice was bitter. When Sarah and Daniel died, people brought food for a week, then forgot I existed. When I needed help getting through that winter, working the ranch alone, nothing. Cedar Ridge decided I was better off left alone with my grief. I'm sorry. Don't be. I learned who I could count on. Turns out it wasn't many. He looked at her directly. But you showed up here expecting nothing, asking for nothing, and you've made this place livable again. More than livable. And tonight you opened our home to strangers without question. Lydia felt her throat tighten. Our home? Caleb's expression softened. That's what it's become, hasn't it? We're partners in this. Whatever this is. Before she could answer, one of the children whimpered in their sleep. Lydia reached out automatically, smoothing the little girl's hair, and the child settled. When she looked up, Caleb was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The storm raged on through the night. Lydia dozed in her chair, waking periodically to tend the fire or check on their guests. Caleb stayed awake, vigilant, rising every hour to inspect the shutters and the roof. Around midnight, a section of the roof began leaking, water streaming down one wall. They moved furniture, placed buckets, worked together wordlessly to contain the damage. By dawn, the storm had gentled to steady rain. Lydia rose stiff and aching, made coffee, started breakfast. The guests woke gradually, disoriented but safe. Margaret emerged from the bedroom looking better, immediately going to check on James. How's the leg? She asked, kneeling beside him. Hurts like hell, begging your pardon, ma'am, James said. But Mr. Rourke said it well, should heal clean if I'm careful. Caleb came in from outside, soaked again. Wagon's a total loss. Axle snapped, wheel shattered. But the horses survived, found them sheltering in a draw. We can fashion a travois if needed, get you folks to town. We were headed west, Samuel said. Is there a town that direction? Not for 40 miles. And not in that direction, not with winter coming. Caleb hesitated. You're welcome to stay here until James can travel. Might be a couple weeks. The brothers exchanged glances. We couldn't impose. You can help around the ranch. There's plenty of work. Caleb looked at Mr. Garrett. You? I was heading to Denver, but I can delay. The old man smiled. And I'm handy with repairs if you need them. Over breakfast, the story emerged. Margaret and James had been traveling from Missouri with their children, hoping for a fresh start in California. They'd met the brothers and Mr. Garrett in the last settlement, offered them space in the wagon. Then the storm had hit with terrifying speed, and the wagon had overturned on a muddy slope. We thought we were going to die out there, Margaret said quietly, holding her children close. Then we saw the light from your house. Like a miracle. Lydia met Caleb's eyes across the table. Not a miracle, just two broken people who decided to stop letting the world defeat them. The next few days settled into a strange new rhythm. James remained immobile, his leg elevated. Margaret helped Lydia with the housework and cooking, grateful for the company. The children, once their fear faded, brought an energy to the house that was both exhausting and oddly joyful. Tommy followed Caleb everywhere, asking endless questions about the horses and cattle. Beth appointed herself Lydia's shadow, helping gather eggs and weed the garden. Samuel and David proved their worth immediately, helping Caleb repair the storm damage, reinforcing the barn, clearing debris. Mr. Garrett fixed the leaking roof, replaced broken shutters, and carved a set of wooden toys for the children that made them squeal with delight. And Lydia discovered something she hadn't expected. She loved having a full house, loved the noise and chaos, loved cooking for many instead of two, loved the sound of children's laughter echoing off the walls. It made the place feel alive in a way it never had before. One afternoon, she was working in the garden with Beth, showing the little girl how to identify ripe tomatoes when Margaret joined them. I need to thank you properly, Margaret said, kneeling in the dirt beside Lydia. What you and Mr. Rourke have done, taking us in, caring for James, letting us stay, it's beyond kind. It's what anyone would do. No, it's not. Margaret's voice was firm. Most people would have given us a night's shelter and sent us on our way, injured husband or not. You've made us family. Lydia felt something crack inside her chest. Family. She hadn't had that since Thomas died. Hadn't let herself want it. We're glad to help, she said quietly. That evening, after supper, with the children asleep and the men talking quietly by the fire, Margaret pulled Lydia aside. Can I ask you something? It's personal, and you can tell me it's none of my business. Lydia tensed. All right. You and Mr. Rourke. You're married? No, I'm his housekeeper, that's all. Margaret studied her with knowing eyes. That's all? Yes. Lydia kept her voice steady. The town sent me here because I was a widow and he needed help. It's an arrangement, nothing more. Lydia, I've seen how he looks at you, how you work together. That's not nothing. He's a good man. We're partners in running this place, but we're both still... She couldn't find the words. Still grieving? Margaret finished softly. I understand, but grief doesn't last forever. And sometimes the people who understand our pain are the ones who can help us heal. Before Lydia could respond, a new sound cut through the evening quiet. Hoofbeats, approaching fast. Then a man's voice shouting. Caleb was at the door instantly, the other men right behind him. Lydia followed, her heart racing. A lone rider came into the circle of lamplight, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. The man himself looked barely better, clothes torn, face scratched and bleeding, eyes desperate. Please, he gasped, half falling from his horse. I need help. My wife, she's hurt bad. We've been traveling, and there's a baby coming, and something's wrong. I saw your lights and thought... His voice broke. Please. She's dying. Caleb grabbed the man's shoulders, steadying him. Where is she? Mile back, maybe less. There's a small cave, sheltered. I left her there to find help. She told me to go, but I can't lose her. Samuel, David, get horses saddled. Mr. Garrett, gather clean cloth, blankets, Lydia. I'm coming with you, Lydia said firmly. If there's a baby coming, you'll need me. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Margaret, watch the children. We'll be back as soon as we can. They rode out into the darkness, following the desperate husband, a young man named Henry who could barely speak coherent sentences. The cave wasn't far, tucked into a rocky outcrop, but every second felt like an eternity. Inside the cave, lit by a single guttering candle, Lydia found a sight that made her blood run cold. The woman, she couldn't have been more than 20, lay on a makeshift bed of blankets, her face gray with pain and blood loss. Her belly was swollen with pregnancy, but something was clearly, terribly wrong. Blood soaked the blankets beneath her, and her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. Lydia knelt beside her immediately, taking her hand. My name is Lydia. We're going to help you. What's your name? Clara, the woman whispered. The baby, something's wrong. It's too early, and I can't push anymore. Lydia looked at Caleb, saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. This was beyond their skill, beyond anything they could fix with determination and improvisation. This woman needed a doctor, needed help they couldn't provide, but they were all she had. We need to move her to the house, Caleb said quietly. She can't labor here. Moving her might kill her, Lydia said. Staying here definitely will. They constructed a makeshift stretcher from branches and blankets, lifted Clara as gently as possible. She screamed with the movement, a sound that tore at Lydia's heart. Henry rode beside them, holding his wife's hand, murmuring prayers and promises. Back at the house, they laid Clara in Lydia's bed. Margaret took one look at the situation and immediately began organizing, sending the children to stay with Mr. Garrett, heating water, gathering clean linens. Lydia washed her hands, said a silent prayer to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, and examined Clara as gently as she could. The baby was coming, but something was wrong with the position, and Clara had already lost too much blood. Lydia looked at Margaret, saw her own certainty reflected there. This woman might not survive the night, but they had to try. For hours they worked. Lydia had helped with births before, back on the farm in Kansas, but never one like this. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, her strength failing. Henry stood in the doorway, held back by Caleb, his face a mask of anguish. Then, near midnight, the baby came, a tiny, perfect boy who emerged silent and blue. Lydia's heart sank. But Margaret grabbed the infant, cleared his mouth and nose with practiced efficiency, rubbed his chest vigorously. For 10 seconds that felt like eternity, nothing happened. Then the baby gasped, coughed, and wailed. The sound of that cry, weak but insistent, filled the room like a benediction. Lydia felt tears streaming down her face as Margaret wrapped the baby in clean cloth and placed him on Clara's chest. Henry rushed forward, his hands shaking as he touched his son's tiny head. "He's here," Henry whispered, his voice breaking. "Clara, look. He's here, and he's alive." But Clara's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and labored. The bleeding hadn't stopped. Lydia pressed clean cloths against the wounds, but they soaked through almost immediately. She looked at Margaret again, saw the older woman's face set with grim determination. "We need to pack the wound," Margaret said quietly, "and pray." They worked through the night, taking turns holding pressure, changing blood-soaked linens, monitoring Clara's pulse. The baby, cleaned and swaddled now, lay in a basket near the fire, his small fists waving. Caleb had taken Henry outside, was keeping him occupied with whiskey and quiet reassurance. The other men stayed up as well, maintaining the vigil that happens when death hovers close. Dawn came gray and uncertain. Clara's breathing had stabilized. The bleeding finally slowed to something manageable. She was desperately weak, her skin paper white, but alive. When her eyes fluttered open, Lydia nearly sobbed with relief. "The baby?" Clara's voice was barely audible. "He's perfect," Lydia said, bringing the basket close. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Clara looked at her son with an expression of such profound love and grief that Lydia had to turn away. She'd seen that look before, on women who knew, somehow, that they wouldn't live to raise their children. Women whose bodies had given everything to bring life into the world, and had nothing left for themselves. "Henry?" Clara whispered. "Right here, love." Henry appeared at her side, dropping to his knees beside the bed. "I'm right here." Clara reached for his hand with trembling fingers. "You have to listen to me. I need you to promise something. Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. Henry, please." Her grip tightened with surprising strength. "Promise me. If I don't make it, you will." "If I don't," Clara continued, her voice firm despite its weakness, "promise me you'll find someone to care for him, someone good, someone who'll love him like I would." "Clara, promise me." Henry's face crumpled. "I promise. But you're going to raise him yourself. You're going to get better, and we're going to—" But Clara had already closed her eyes again, exhausted by the brief exchange. Lydia gently ushered Henry out, giving Clara space to rest. In the main room, she found Caleb standing by the window, watching the sunrise. "How is she?" he asked without turning. "Alive. For now." Lydia sank into a chair, every bone in her body aching with fatigue. "But she's lost so much blood, and she's so weak. I don't know if you did everything you could. It might not be enough." Caleb turned then, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "When Sarah died, I kept thinking about all the things I could have done differently, all the ways I might have saved her. It ate at me for years." He crossed to where Lydia sat, knelt beside her chair. "But the truth is, sometimes we can do everything right and still lose. That's not failure, Lydia. That's just life being cruel." She reached out, touched his face, the gesture surprising both of them. "You're a good man, Caleb Rourke." "I'm trying to be." Again. He covered her hand with his own. "You make me want to be." The moment hung between them, fragile and tentative. Then Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face grave, and they both knew. Clara lasted 3 more days. She rallied briefly on the second day, was able to hold her son and whisper to him, was able to tell Henry how much she loved him. But by the 3rd day, fever had set in, the kind of infection that follows childbirth sometimes, the kind no amount of care can stop. She burned and shivered, drifted in and out of delirium, and slowly, inexorably, slipped away. On the morning of the fourth day, with autumn rain pattering soft against the windows, Clara opened her eyes one last time. Lydia was sitting with her, had been all night, while Henry slept fitfully in a chair nearby and the baby dozed in his basket. "Lydia?" Clara's voice was a thread. "I'm here." "The baby. What will—" "Henry can't raise him alone. He's a good man, but he doesn't know. He won't know how to—" She gasped, fighting for breath. You took us in, strangers. You cared for us like family." "Clara, rest. Save your strength." "There's no strength left." Clara's hand found Lydia's, gripped with desperate intensity. "Please. If Henry can't, if something happens, please take my son. Raise him. Love him." Lydia's throat closed. "I can't promise. Please." Tears slid down Clara's temples. "I'm dying. I can feel it, and I can't leave my baby to chance. You're good. I see it in you. And Mr. Rourke, he's lost children, hasn't he? He understands. Please, promise me you'll take care of my son if Henry can't." Lydia looked at this dying woman, this mother making the most desperate bargain in the world, and felt something break open inside her chest. All the years she'd spent being told she was worthless because she couldn't have children, all the shame and grief and hollow ache of it. And here was a woman offering her the most precious thing in the world, not out of charity or pity, but out of trust. "I promise," Lydia whispered. "If it comes to that, I promise I'll raise him as my own." Clara's face relaxed, something like peace settling over her features. "Thank you. His name, we were going to call him Eli, after Henry's father." "Eli," Lydia repeated. "It's a beautiful name. Tell him his mother loved him more than life. Tell him—" But the words faded, and Clara's breathing grew shallower, more labored. Lydia called for Henry, for Margaret. They gathered around Clara's bed as the rain continued its soft percussion and the baby slept on, unaware that the world was changing. Clara died as the sun broke through the clouds, her hand in Henry's, her son's name on her lips. The grief that followed was complicated and terrible. Henry fell apart completely, unable to look at the baby without breaking down. The infant, little Eli, seemed to sense the absence, cried more, slept less. Lydia found herself walking him at all hours, rocking him, singing the lullabies her own mother had sung to her long ago. They buried Clara on a hill overlooking the valley, under a cottonwood that had turned gold with autumn. Henry stood silent throughout the brief service, his face a mask of devastation. Afterward, he approached Lydia with red-rimmed eyes. "I can't," he said simply. "I can't look at him without seeing her, without remembering that she died bringing him into the world. Henry, you're grieving. Give yourself time." "There isn't enough time in the world." His voice was hollow. "I thought I could do it. Thought I could honor her by raising our son. But every time I hold him, I feel her dying in my arms all over again." "What are you saying?" Henry looked at her with desperate, broken eyes. "Clara asked you to take him, didn't she? I heard her. In those last hours, she asked you to promise." Lydia's heart began to hammer. "She asked me to care for him if you couldn't. But you're his father. I'm a man who can't even look at his own son without wanting to die." Henry's hands shook. "Please, take him. Raise him like Clara wanted. Give him the life I can't." "You can't mean that." "I do." Henry pulled out a folded paper, pressed it into Lydia's hands. "I wrote it all down. My legal relinquishment, witnessed by Mr. Garrett. The baby is yours, if you'll have him. I'll send money when I can, but I can't stay here. I can't be his father, not the way he deserves." Before Lydia could respond, Henry turned and walked away, heading toward the barn where his horse was stabled. Within the hour, he was gone, riding east toward whatever life he thought he could survive without his wife and son. Lydia stood on the porch, holding the legal paper in one hand and little Eli in the other, and felt the weight of an impossible choice settle onto her shoulders. Caleb found her there as the sun was setting. He looked at the baby in her arms, at the paper in her hand, and understanding dawned in his eyes. "He left," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. He couldn't bear it. Looking at Eli and seeing Clara, Lydia's voice cracked. He signed over his rights, asked me to take him, to raise him. What do you want to do? It was the question that mattered. Not what she should do, not what was expected or proper or sensible. What she wanted. Lydia looked down at the baby sleeping against her shoulder, his tiny face peaceful in slumber. She thought about all the years of emptiness, of being defined by what she couldn't do, of watching other women with their children and feeling that hollow ache. And she thought about Clara's dying wish, about the trust placed in her hands. I want to keep him, she whispered. I want to be his mother. Caleb stepped closer, his hand gentle on her back. Then we'll keep him. We? You think I'm going to let you raise a baby alone? In this house? Under my roof? His voice was rough with emotion. That boy needs a father as much as a mother, and I lost my son. Maybe this is a chance to... He couldn't finish, but he didn't have to. Lydia turned to face him fully, this man who'd started as a stranger, become a partner, and was now offering to become something more. Are you saying us? I'm saying we make it legal. We adopt him together. We raise him as ours. Caleb's eyes were fierce. And we do it right. Not as an arrangement, not as a convenience, as a real family. Caleb, I know this is sudden. I know we're both still figuring out what we are to each other, but this, he gestured to the baby, this matters more than our hesitation. This boy deserves parents who will fight for him, who will love him. Can we do that? Together? Lydia felt tears spilling down her cheeks. Everything she'd lost, everything she'd thought was gone forever. It was being offered back to her in the most unexpected way. Not the life she'd planned, but maybe the life she was meant to have. Yes, she said. Yes, we can. That night they sat together in the main room, taking turns holding Eli, making plans. They'd go to town in the morning, file the adoption papers, make it all legal and official. They'd face whatever questions or judgment came their way. They'd build a life around this child who'd come to them through tragedy and hope. Margaret and James, still recovering but strong enough now, offered their support. The brothers and Mr. Garrett stood as witnesses to the decision. The house that had been a place of exile and loneliness was now filled with people bound together by shared experience and chosen family. But when dawn came and they prepared to make the journey to Cedar Ridge, a new complication appeared on the horizon. A rider approached the ranch at a gallop, dust rising behind him. Caleb stepped onto the porch, instantly wary. The rider was well-dressed, his horse expensive, his bearing that of a man used to authority and deference. He dismounted with practiced ease, removed his hat, and fixed Caleb with a calculating stare. "Mr. Caleb Rourke?" "That's right. What's your business?" "My name is Vernon Ashford. I'm an attorney from Denver, and I'm here about the child born to Clara Ashford 4 days ago." Lydia's blood ran cold. She stepped forward. Eli held protectively against her chest. Clara's name was Patterson. She was married to Henry Patterson. Vernon's smile was thin and cold. Actually, Clara's legal name was Clara Marie Ashford. She was my wife, and the child you're holding is my legitimate son and heir. The world seemed to tilt. Caleb's hand found Lydia's shoulder, steadying her. "That's not possible. Henry Patterson was her husband. Henry Patterson was a ranch hand who seduced my wife and ran off with her 6 months ago." Vernon's voice was clipped, precise. "I've been searching for them ever since. When I heard about a woman giving birth and dying in this area, I came immediately, and now I'm here to claim what's mine." "You're lying," Lydia said, but even as she spoke, she felt doubt creeping in. Clara had been so young, so frightened, and Henry had left so quickly, hadn't he? Hadn't questioned whether he had the right to sign away the child. Vernon pulled papers from his saddlebag, unfolded them with a flourish. "Marriage certificate, dated 2 years ago in Denver. Property deeds in both our names. Letters from Clara to her sister, describing her life with me. And most importantly, a birth record filed by a midwife in the last town they passed through, listing me as the father." He held them out, and Caleb took them with reluctant hands, scanning the documents with growing tension. "These could be forged," Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. They could be verified by any judge in the territory, which is exactly what I intend to do. Vernon stepped closer, his eyes on the baby. I'm a wealthy man, Mr. Rourke. I can provide my son with everything, education, status, opportunities you could never offer, and I have every legal right to him. Even if what you're saying is true, Lydia said, her voice shaking with fury, you let your wife run away. You didn't protect her. You weren't there when she needed you. She died in my arms, and with her last breath, she asked me to care for her son. That has to mean something. It means she was confused and dying. It has no legal weight. Vernon's tone was dismissive. I'll be generous. I'll give you a day to say your goodbyes. Then I'm taking my son back to Denver where he belongs. No. The word came out of Lydia like a gunshot. No, you're not taking him anywhere. Clara wanted him to have love, to have safety. She trusted me. And I'm not handing him over to a stranger who claims to be his father but let his mother die alone. Vernon's expression hardened. Mrs. Hart, is it? I suggest you reconsider your position. I have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, judges, connections throughout the territory. If you fight me on this, I will destroy you. I'll make sure everyone knows you as the woman who tried to steal a grieving father's child. You'll never work again, never have peace again. Get off my property. Caleb's voice was quiet, deadly. Right now. I'll leave, for now. Vernon mounted his horse with fluid grace. But I'll be back tomorrow with a marshal and proper documentation. You can hand the child over peacefully, or you can face kidnapping charges. Your choice. He rode off, leaving a wake of dust and dread. Lydia stood frozen, clutching Eli so tightly he whimpered in protest. Caleb gently took the baby from her, passed him to Margaret, then pulled Lydia into his arms as she finally broke down, great racking sobs shaking her whole body. He can't take him, she gasped against Caleb's chest. He can't. I promised Clara. I promised. I know. And we're going to fight. Caleb's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. We're not giving up that boy without a war. Inside the house, they gathered everyone. Samuel and David, James and Margaret, Mr. Garrett, all of them witnesses to what had happened, all of them ready to testify. They pored over the documents Vernon had left, looking for weaknesses, inconsistencies. Mr. Garrett, who turned out to have studied law before becoming a traveling merchant, pointed out several problems. The birth record doesn't prove paternity. The letters could have been written under duress. And most importantly, if Clara truly wanted to leave Vernon, there might be grounds to argue abandonment or cruelty. But we don't have proof of that, Lydia said desperately. We only have what Clara told us in those last days, and she was delirious with fever half the time. Then we need to find Henry Patterson, Caleb said. He's the only one who can tell us the truth about Clara's marriage. He could be anywhere by now. He had a day's head start. Samuel! David! Caleb turned to the brothers. Can you ride? Track him? The brothers exchanged glances, then nodded. We grew up hunting in Missouri. We can track a man. Then go. Find Henry Patterson. Bring him back here. We need his testimony. As the brothers prepared to ride out, Margaret approached Lydia with Eli in her arms. Whatever happens, you gave that woman peace in her final hours. You kept her son safe and loved. That's not nothing. It won't matter if Vernon takes him. Then we make sure he doesn't. Margaret's voice was fierce. I lost 2 children to scarlet fever before Tommy and Beth were born. I know what it's like to have empty arms. And I see the way you look at this baby. You're already his mother in every way that counts. We'll fight for him. That night, Lydia barely slept. She kept Eli in her room, watching him sleep, memorizing every detail of his face. She sang to him, whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep, and tried not to think about what would happen if Vernon succeeded in taking him away. Caleb appeared in her doorway near midnight. Can't sleep either? Every time I close my eyes, I see Vernon riding off with him. Caleb entered the room, sat on the edge of the bed. When I lost Daniel, I thought I'd never survive the grief. I wanted to die with him. For months, I barely functioned. Then slowly, painfully, I learned to live again. But there's been this hole in my chest ever since, this emptiness where he should have been. He reached out, touched Eli's tiny hand. This boy, he doesn't replace Daniel. Nothing could. But he makes me feel like maybe I could be a father again, like maybe I deserve a second chance. We both deserve second chances. Lydia whispered. Then we fight for this one. Together. Caleb took her hand. Tomorrow, we're going to town. We're going to file those adoption papers before Vernon can stop us. We're going to tell anyone who'll listen what Clara wanted, what we promised her. And we're going to make them understand that this isn't about legal documents or blood rights. It's about what's best for this child. What if it's not enough? Then we'll figure out what comes next. But we don't give up, Lydia. Not on him, not on each other, not on this family we're building. The next morning, they rode to Cedar Ridge with purpose and dread warring in their chests. Eli was bundled carefully against Lydia's body, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the battle being fought for his future. Cedar Ridge buzzed with gossip when they arrived. Word had somehow spread about the dying woman, the abandoned baby, the wealthy stranger claiming paternal rights. Martha Kinsley intercepted them before they could reach the courthouse. Lydia, Mr. Rourke, is it true? About the baby? It's true that his mother died in our care, Lydia said steadily, and that she asked us to raise him. We're here to make it legal. But if the father, we're handling it, Mrs. Kinsley. Caleb's tone made it clear the conversation was over. They filed the adoption papers with Judge Morrison, an older man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. He listened to their story, examined Henry's relinquishment document, and nodded slowly. This is highly irregular. The father's signature appears genuine, but if another party contests the adoption claiming prior paternal rights, we understand there may be a dispute, Caleb said, but we want our intent on record. Clara Patterson, or Clara Ashford if that's her legal name, entrusted this child to us with her dying words. We're prepared to fight for him. Judge Morrison looked at Eli, sleeping peacefully in Lydia's arms, then back at them. I'll file the papers. But be warned. If Vernon Ashford's documentation is legitimate, you're facing an uphill battle. Blood rights typically supersede adoptive claims, especially when contested by a legal father. Even a father who abandoned his wife, who let her die alone. Lydia's voice shook with anger. That would need to be proven in court. Can you do that? They couldn't, not yet, not without Henry. They left the courthouse with the adoption papers filed, but their future uncertain. And as they crossed the street back to their wagon, Vernon Ashford appeared with a marshal at his side and a smile that promised devastation. Marshal Webb, these are the people I mentioned, Vernon's voice carried across the street with practiced authority. The ones holding my son illegally. The marshal, a weather-beaten man in his 50s with a badge that had seen better days, looked uncomfortable. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Hart, I need you to understand I'm just here to keep the peace. Mr. Ashford has presented some compelling documentation. We just filed adoption papers with Judge Morrison, Caleb said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating through his body. Legal papers based on the mother's dying wishes and the father's written relinquishment. Vernon laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. The father? You mean the ranch hand who kidnapped my wife? His signature means nothing. He had no legal right to give away my child. Then let's settle this properly, Lydia said, her arms tightening protectively around Eli. In front of a judge, with all the evidence presented fairly. An excellent suggestion. Vernon's smile never reached his eyes. Judge Morrison, I presume you're available to hear this matter immediately. The judge had emerged from the courthouse, drawn by the commotion. A small crowd was gathering now, townspeople sensing drama, Martha Kinsley and her circle of gossips positioning themselves for the best view. Lydia felt the weight of their stares, their judgment, their hungry curiosity. My chambers, Judge Morrison said curtly. Now, the rest of you disperse. This isn't a circus. Inside the judge's chambers, the air was thick with tension and the smell of old law books. Vernon sat with the casual confidence of a man who'd never lost anything that mattered. Caleb and Lydia stood together, Eli still sleeping against Lydia's shoulder, and waited for the world to end or begin anew. Judge Morrison settled behind his desk, glasses perched on his nose. Mr. Ashford, you're claiming legal paternity of the infant currently in Mrs. Hart's care. Present your evidence. Vernon laid out his documents with theatrical precision. The marriage certificate first, dated nearly 2 years prior in Denver. Property records showing a substantial house registered to Vernon and Clara Ashford jointly. Letters in Clara's handwriting describing her life as a wealthy man's wife. And finally, a birth record from a small town 3 weeks prior, listing Vernon Ashford as the father. As you can see, Your Honor, my claim is ironclad. Clara was my legal wife. The child is my legitimate heir. Whatever lies she may have told in her final delirium, whatever illegal arrangement this Mr. Patterson may have concocted, none of it supersedes my paternal rights. Judge Morrison examined each document carefully. Lydia watched his face, trying to read his thoughts, and felt her hope bleeding away with each passing second. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Hart, what evidence do you have to counter these claims? Caleb produced Henry's relinquishment paper. This was signed by the man who brought Clara to our door. He identified himself as her husband, and she never contradicted that claim. She entrusted her son to Mrs. Hart's care with her final words. Witnessed by whom? Myself, Caleb said, and several travelers who'd taken shelter at our ranch during the storm. Margaret and James Fletcher, Mr. Garrett, Samuel, and David Morrison. No relation to yourself, Your Honor. Vernon waved his hand dismissively. The ravings of a dying woman and the testimony of transients, hardly compelling compared to legal documentation. Clara was terrified, Lydia said, her voice shaking but determined. In those final days, when she had moments of clarity, she talked about running from something, someone. She begged me to keep her son safe, to not let him fall into the wrong hands. My hands, you mean? Vernon's eyebrows rose. Your Honor, this is pure fabrication. Clara suffered from melancholia, female hysteria. She had delusions, episodes where she imagined I was mistreating her. It's why she was so easily manipulated by Patterson. The man took advantage of a sick woman. That's a lie, Lydia said fiercely. She wasn't delusional. She was desperate. There's a difference. Judge Morrison held up his hand. Mrs. Hart, I understand your emotional investment in this child, but emotion doesn't supersede law. Mr. Ashford has presented documentation that appears legitimate. Unless you can provide concrete evidence that he's unfit or that his marriage to Clara was invalid, the door burst open. Samuel and David stood there, breathless and dust-covered, with Henry Patterson between them. The young man looked worse than when he'd left. Hollow-eyed, unshaven, broken. But he was here. Your Honor, Samuel said, we have testimony that might change things. Vernon's face went white, then red with fury. Who the hell? Henry Patterson, the young man said, his voice hoarse. Clara's real husband. And I've got things to say about Mr. Vernon Ashford that need hearing. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp with interest. Mr. Patterson, you claim to be Clara's husband. I am her husband. Was. Henry's voice cracked. We married 6 months ago in a little church outside Cheyenne. I can prove it. I've got our certificate, letters she wrote me, witnesses who saw the ceremony. Impossible, Vernon snapped. Clara was already married to me. She thought she was, Henry said. That's what you told her, isn't it? That you'd married her legal in Denver, that she was your wife proper. But you lied, Mr. Ashford. You were already married. The room went silent. Vernon's carefully constructed composure cracked just for a moment before he regained control. That's a slanderous accusation. It's the truth. Henry pulled a folded newspaper from his coat, hands shaking. This is the Denver Post from 8 months back. Society page. Announcing the 10th wedding anniversary of Mr. Vernon Ashford and his wife, Catherine Ashford, of the Denver Ashfords, celebrating at their estate with 200 guests. He laid the newspaper on the judge's desk. Vernon moved to grab it, but Marshal Webb stepped between them, his expression hardening. Judge Morrison read the announcement, his face darkening. Mr. Ashford, is this accurate? Were you married to another woman when you allegedly married Clara? That marriage was annulled. When? Henry's voice was sharp with grief-fueled anger. Before or after you convinced Clara she was your wife? Before or after you got her pregnant? Before or after you kept her locked in that house like property? I did no such thing. You did. Henry turned to the judge. Clara told me everything once she trusted me enough. How Vernon presented himself as a wealthy bachelor, courted her proper-like, talked about marriage. How he took her to a justice of the peace. At least that's what she thought it was. Private ceremony, just the two of them, and some official he'd paid off. Gave her a ring, installed her in a house on the edge of town where she never saw anyone, told her it was for her protection, that Denver society took time to accept outsiders. Vernon's hands clenched into fists. Your Honor, this is clearly a coordinated fiction designed to— She was 17, Henry continued, his voice breaking. Alone in a strange city, no family, no friends. She believed him because she loved him and because she didn't know better. But then she got pregnant, and Vernon's visits became less frequent. She started asking questions about meeting his family, about going to social events, about why they never went out in public together. And Vernon got angry, started threatening her, said if she made trouble, he'd have her committed to an asylum, that no one would believe a word she said. Judge Morrison's expression was stone. These are serious accusations, Mr. Patterson. Can you prove any of this? I can prove the marriage to Catherine Ashford was never annulled. I spent the last 3 weeks tracking it down. Henry produced more papers, his hands steadier now with purpose. Marriage records from Denver, court documents showing no annulment was ever filed. And this— He pulled out a letter, the paper worn from multiple readings. This is from Clara's sister in Chicago. Clara wrote to her 6 months before she ran away, describing everything I just told you. Her sister kept the letter, dated and postmarked. Vernon was on his feet now, his careful facade crumbling into rage. That proves nothing. A confused girl's fantasies. It proves you're a liar and a bigamist, Caleb said quietly. It proves that whatever ceremony you performed with Clara wasn't legal, which means you have no paternal rights whatsoever. The child is still mine by blood. Is he? Margaret's voice came from the doorway. She'd followed the brothers in, had been listening from outside. Because Clara told me something in those final hours. She said the baby came early, too early, that she'd been with Vernon nearly a year before, but not since, that the timing didn't match unless— She paused, looked at Henry with sympathy. Henry's face flushed. The child is mine. Clara and we were together before we married proper. We were planning to run away together, and we— He couldn't finish, but he didn't have to. Vernon's laugh was ugly. So the child is a bastard either way, born of adultery and sin. The child was born of love, Lydia said fiercely, standing now with Eli held close. Clara loved Henry. She ran away from you because you were keeping her prisoner, because you lied to her, because you had no right to her or her baby. And with her dying breath, she asked me to protect her son from exactly this, from a man who sees him as property instead of a person. Judge Morrison removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes. Mr. Ashford, I'm ordering you to produce proof of annulment from Catherine Ashford. If you cannot do so within 24 hours, I'm prepared to rule that your marriage to Clara was fraudulent and void, which would eliminate any paternal claim you might have. You can't— I can, and I will. Marshal Webb, Mr. Ashford is not to leave town until this matter is resolved. If he attempts to do so, arrest him. The judge turned to Henry. Mr. Patterson, your marriage to Clara, can you produce the certificate? I can. It's back at the boarding house where I've been staying. I'll fetch it now. Do that, and bring any other documentation that supports your claim. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. Judge Morrison looked at Lydia and Caleb. The child remains in your care until this is settled. But understand, if Mr. Patterson's marriage is proven legitimate and he's determined to be the biological father, he has legal rights that supersede your adoption claim. Henry looked at Eli for the first time since entering the room. Pain crossed his face, raw and terrible. I already told Mrs. Hart. I can't raise him. Every time I look at him, I see Clara dying, but I won't let that man have him either. He turned to Vernon, his eyes hard. You took Clara from her family with lies. You kept her isolated and afraid. You have no right to her son. Vernon's composure was gone entirely now, replaced with cold fury. This isn't over. I have resources, connections. You have a wife in Denver who's probably wondering where you've been, Marshal Webb said dryly, and now you've got legal trouble brewing. I suggest you focus on that instead of making threats. They spilled out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight that seemed too bright, too normal for the battle they'd just fought. Henry stood apart from the group, staring at nothing. Lydia approached him carefully. Thank you, she said quietly. for coming back, for telling the truth. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because Clara deserved better than to have her son raised by that monster. Henry's eyes filled with tears. I loved her. I know running away with her was wrong, that we should have found another way, but I loved her, and I got her killed. No, you tried to save her. Vernon killed her, with his lies, his control, his refusal to let her go. Lydia shifted Eli slightly. She spoke of you at the end. She said you were a good man. Not good enough to keep her alive. Good enough that she wanted you to be free of guilt. Good enough that she trusted you with her last wishes. Lydia hesitated. The judge was right. If your marriage is proven legal and you're the father, you have rights. But your relinquishment stands too. You already gave us permission to adopt him. Henry looked at this baby properly then, his expression breaking. He looks like her. Same nose, same chin. He reached out, touched Eli's tiny hand with one finger. I meant what I said. I can't be his father, but I can make sure the right people are. Tomorrow, when we're back in front of the judge, I'll testify to everything. I'll make it clear that Vernon has no claim and that you and Mr. Rourke should raise him. Even though it means giving up your son? He's not my son. Not really. Henry's voice was thick with grief. He's the child Clara wanted protected and loved, and you're the people she chose. That's what matters. That evening, they returned to the ranch in somber procession. Margaret and James, Mr. Garrett, the brothers, all of them invested now in Eli's future. They gathered around the table for a quiet meal, the baby sleeping in his basket near the fire. Tomorrow will be the real fight, Mr. Garrett said. Vernon won't give up easily. Men like him don't accept defeat. He's got no legal ground to stand on, David argued. The marriage was fake, he's a bigamist, and Henry's prepared to testify. Legal ground and actual power are different things, Caleb said quietly. Vernon mentioned resources and connections. He'll use them. Lydia stood abruptly, unable to bear the speculation. She lifted Eli from his basket and carried him to her room, needing space to think, to process, to simply breathe. Caleb found her there an hour later, sitting by the window with Eli in her arms, watching the stars emerge. You all right? He asked softly. I'm terrified. Vernon looked at us today like we were insects he was planning to crush. And even with Henry's testimony, even with proof of Vernon's lies, what if the judge decides blood matters more than anything else? What if... Her voice broke. Caleb crossed the room, knelt beside her chair. Then we appeal. We fight harder. We don't stop until that boy is legally and permanently ours. Ours? Lydia repeated softly. A week ago, I didn't even know this child existed. Now I can't imagine life without him. Neither can I. Caleb reached out, touched Eli's sleeping face with gentle fingers. When Daniel died, I thought that part of me died too. The part that could be a father, could love a child without being crushed by fear of losing them. But this, holding him, knowing he depends on us, it makes me feel alive again. We could still lose him. We could, but we've already decided we're going to fight, so let's fight smart. Caleb stood, began pacing. Vernon wants the baby because he's an heir. That's what he kept saying, my son, an heir. He's got a wife in Denver, but apparently no children. Why would a man in a comfortable marriage need a child born of bigamy and deception? Lydia's mind raced. Unless his wife can't have children, or unless there's some inheritance, some requirement that he produce an heir to, she stopped, understanding dawning. Money. It's always about money with men like Vernon. Tomorrow, I'm sending a telegram to Denver. I've got contacts there from before, people who knew Sarah's family. Someone must know about Vernon Ashford and his circumstances. What if we don't get answers in time? Then we use what we have. Henry's testimony, Clara's letters, the proof of bigamy, and we make the judge understand that this isn't about legal technicalities. It's about a child's welfare. Caleb's eyes met hers, fierce and certain. We make them see that we're his real parents, regardless of blood. The next morning came too quickly. Lydia dressed with shaking hands, fed Eli, and tried to memorize every detail of his face in case this was the last day she'd have with him. The thought was unbearable, but she forced herself to confront it. If Vernon somehow won, if the law sided with blood and property over love and protection, she needed to be prepared. But preparation didn't make it hurt less. They rode to Cedar Ridge in grim silence. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Word had spread fast, and the entire town seemed determined to witness the outcome. Martha Kinsley actually approached Lydia with something like sympathy in her eyes. "I heard what that man did. To Clara. To you." Martha's voice was quiet. "I want you to know, if you need character witnesses, people who can testify to your fitness as a mother, I'll speak for you." Lydia stared at her in shock. "You would do that?" "I was wrong about you, about sending you away like we did. You've made a life out there, made something good out of terrible circumstances. And that baby—" Martha looked at Eli. "That baby deserves to stay with someone who loves him, not with a man who sees him as property." Other women approached with similar offers. The Reverend, several shopkeepers, even Ben Farrow, who'd once worked for Caleb. The community that had exiled Lydia was now rallying behind her, and the irony wasn't lost on her. Inside the courthouse, Vernon sat with a new lawyer, an expensive-looking man from Denver with cold eyes and sharp features. Henry was there too, cleaned up and steady. And Judge Morrison, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. "Before we begin," the judge said, "I want to make something clear. This case has become about more than simple paternity. We're dealing with allegations of bigamy, fraud, possible coercion. The law is complex and emotions are running high. I expect civility from all parties." Vernon's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client maintains that regardless of the circumstances surrounding his relationship with Clara Patterson, Clara's legal name was never Ashford," Henry interrupted. "Our marriage certificate proves that." The lawyer continued smoothly. "Regardless, if paternity can be established through blood, Mr. Ashford has certain rights. Paternity has not been established," Mr. Garrett said, standing. "Mr. Patterson claims to be the biological father. There's no evidence to support Mr. Ashford's claim beyond his own word." "Which brings us to an interesting question," Judge Morrison said. "How do we determine paternity in a case like this?" The courtroom fell silent, because the truth was, there was no way to know for certain. Not without Clara alive to testify, not without medical science that didn't exist yet. Vernon's lawyer smiled thinly. "We have circumstantial evidence. My client lived with Clara for nearly a year, under false pretenses," Caleb interjected, "while lying to her about his existing marriage. And Mr. Patterson admits to intimate relations with Clara before their marriage," the lawyer continued, "which by his own admission would make the child illegitimate." "The child was born within a legal marriage," Henry said firmly. "Clara and I were married when Eli was born. That makes him legitimate, regardless of when he was conceived." Judge Morrison held up his hand. "Gentlemen, this argument could continue indefinitely. What we need to focus on is what's best for the child. Mr. Patterson, you've signed over your parental rights to Mr. Rourke and Mrs. Hart. Is that correct?" "It is, Your Honor." "And you stand by that decision?" Henry looked at Eli, his face a map of pain and resolution. "I do. Clara wanted her son raised by people who would love him and protect him. The Rourkes are those people." "We're not married," Lydia said suddenly. Every head in the courtroom turned. "Caleb and I, we're not husband and wife. Not yet. We filed adoption papers as individuals, planning to marry once the adoption was finalized. But we're not legally married." Vernon's lawyer pounced. "Then the adoption is invalid. An unmarried woman cannot adopt a child alone." "I can," Caleb said. "As a widower, as a property owner, I have the right to adopt. And once Eli is legally mine, Lydia and I will marry, making her his legal mother." "That's not how the law works." "Actually," Judge Morrison said slowly, "it is. If Mr. Rourke adopts the child as a single man and then marries Mrs. Hart, she would become the child's stepmother with full parental rights." He looked at Caleb and Lydia. "Is that your intention? To marry?" Lydia and Caleb looked at each other, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. This wasn't just about saving Eli anymore. This was about choosing each other, choosing a future, choosing to build something real from the ashes of their separate griefs. "Yes," Caleb said, "that's our intention." Then we need to establish whether Mr. Ashford has any legal claim to prevent such an adoption. Judge Morrison turned to Vernon. Do you have proof of annulment from Catherine Ashford? Vernon's jaw clenched. The annulment is in process, so you don't have proof, which means your marriage to Clara was fraudulent and void, which means you have no legal standing as a father, biological or otherwise. The judge's voice was hard. Do you have any other evidence to present? The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman entered, beautifully dressed, her face set with cold fury. Behind her came a man in a suit carrying a leather case. I have evidence, the woman said. My name is Catherine Ashford, and I'm very interested in what my husband has been doing. Vernon went pale. Catherine, don't. Her voice could have frozen fire. Don't you dare speak to me. She approached the bench, her lawyer at her side. Your Honor, I've just learned about my husband's activities over the past 2 years. His fake marriage to a 17-year-old girl, his attempts to claim a child that isn't his, and most importantly, his reason for wanting that child. She turned to look at Vernon with undisguised contempt. Tell them, Vernon. Tell them about your uncle's will. Vernon's lawyer tried to intervene. Mrs. Ashford, this is hardly the time. It's exactly the time. Catherine pulled documents from her own lawyer's case. Vernon's uncle, my uncle by marriage, died 6 months ago. He left a fortune of nearly $500,000, but the inheritance had conditions. Vernon had to produce a legitimate male heir within 1 year of his uncle's death, or the money would go to charity. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison banged his gavel for order. Catherine continued, her voice cutting through the noise. I can't have children. Vernon has known this for years, but he never told me about the inheritance requirement until after his uncle died. Then he became desperate, started talking about adoption, about finding a solution. I didn't know... Her voice cracked slightly. I didn't know he'd created an entire false marriage, seduced a child, and was now trying to steal her baby to secure his fortune. Vernon lunged to his feet. That's not... You're twisting... Sit down, Mr. Ashford, Judge Morrison said sharply. Mrs. Ashford, can you prove these allegations? I can. Her lawyer laid out the uncle's will, the inheritance terms, correspondence between Vernon and his lawyer discussing strategies for meeting the heir requirement. Everything is documented. My husband is attempting to kidnap a child solely to secure a fortune he has no legal right to. Lydia felt like she couldn't breathe. This was it, the proof they needed that Vernon's motives were purely mercenary, that he had no genuine interest in Eli's welfare. Judge Morrison read through the documents, his expression growing darker. Finally, he looked up at Vernon with undisguised disgust. Mr. Ashford, based on the evidence presented, fraudulent marriage, bigamy, and now clear evidence of mercenary motives, I am denying any claim you might have to the child known as Eli. Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into your conduct. You're fortunate I don't have you arrested for fraud right now. Vernon's face went purple with rage. You can't. I can and I have. Marshal Webb, please escort Mr. Ashford from my courtroom. As the marshal moved forward, Vernon turned on Lydia with pure venom. This isn't over. I have connections. I have money. You have nothing, Catherine said coldly. By the time I'm done, you won't have a penny to your name or a friend in the territory. Your connections are my connections, Vernon, and they're all about to learn exactly what kind of man you are. Vernon was removed, still protesting, still threatening. Catherine watched him go, then turned to Lydia. I'm sorry for what he put you through, for what he did to Clara. Her eyes glistened. I would have liked to meet her, to apologize for not protecting her from my husband. She didn't blame you, Lydia said softly. She talked about you once, said Vernon told her his first wife had died. She felt terrible about being a replacement. Catherine's composure finally cracked. Oh, that poor child. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. Mrs. Ashford, will you be pursuing any action against Mr. and Mrs. Rourke, or Mr. Rourke and Mrs. Hart, as they currently are? Absolutely not. That baby belongs with people who love him. Catherine looked at Eli, sleeping peacefully through all the drama. I hope he has a beautiful life. The judge turned to Henry. Mr. Patterson, your testimony has been invaluable. However, your relinquishment of parental rights stands on record. Are you certain you wish to proceed with the adoption? Henry stood, his whole body trembling. I am, Your Honor. I'm not strong enough to be the father Eli deserves, but the Rourkes are. Well, then it's settled. Judge Morrison signed the papers before him with firm strokes. Eli Patterson is hereby legally adopted by Caleb Rourke, to be known henceforth as Eli Rourke. The adoption is final and binding. Lydia couldn't stop the sob that escaped her. Caleb's arm came around her shoulders, holding her upright as relief and joy flooded through her body. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm expediting marriage license proceedings for Mr. Rourke and Mrs. Hart. You can be married as soon as you wish, which will finalize Mrs. Hart's parental rights. Today? Caleb said hoarsely. We'll marry today. The courtroom erupted in applause. People Lydia barely knew were crying, hugging each other, celebrating a victory that felt like justice finally served. Through it all, Eli slept on, unaware that his entire future had just been secured. Outside the courthouse, Henry approached them one last time. He looked at Eli with an expression of such profound love and loss that Lydia wanted to weep for him. Can I? His voice broke. Can I hold him? Just once? Lydia placed Eli in his arms without hesitation. Henry cradled his son, tears streaming down his face, and whispered words too soft for anyone else to hear. Then he kissed the baby's forehead gently and handed him back. Take care of him. Tell him his mother was the bravest, most beautiful person I ever knew, and that I'm sorry I couldn't be strong enough for both of them. We'll tell him, Caleb promised. And if you ever want to see him, to be part of his life, no. Henry shook his head. Clean break is better, for him and for me. But thank you. For everything. He turned and walked away, and Lydia knew somehow that they'd never see him again. He'd disappear into the vast western territories, carrying his grief and his guilt to wherever men went to forget. An hour later, in the same courthouse where they'd fought for their son, Caleb Rourke and Lydia Hart became husband and wife in a simple ceremony witnessed by friends and strangers alike. The reverend who'd once shipped Lydia away like unwanted freight now pronounced them married with genuine warmth. When Caleb kissed her, their first real kiss, Lydia felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Pure, uncomplicated hope for a future that might actually be happy. They returned to the ranch as a family. Margaret and James, planning to stay through winter now that James's leg was healing. Samuel and David, who'd decided they liked ranch work better than drifting. Mr. Garrett, who'd found unexpected peace in this corner of Wyoming. And Caleb, Lydia, and baby Eli. A family forged not by blood, but by choice, by sacrifice, by love that had survived every test. That night, with Eli sleeping peacefully in his cradle and the house finally quiet, Lydia stood on the porch watching the stars. Caleb joined her, slipping his arm around her waist in a gesture that was becoming familiar, becoming theirs. Mrs. Rourke, he said softly, testing out the name. Mr. Rourke, she replied, smiling. Think we'll be all right? Lydia looked back through the window at their sleeping son, at the home they'd built from brokenness. I think we already are. But even as she said it, she felt a chill run down her spine. Vernon's final words echoed in her mind. This isn't over. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully, and somewhere out there in the darkness, threats she couldn't yet see were gathering strength. The chill Lydia felt that night proved prophetic. 3 days after the courthouse victory, a writer arrived at dawn with a telegram from Denver. Caleb read it twice, his face darkening, then handed it to Lydia without a word. Urgent stop. Vernon Ashford filing appeal. Stop. Claims, fraud, and adoption proceedings. Stop. Requesting custody reversal. Stop. Case reopens next month. Stop. Advise legal counsel immediately. Stop. Lydia's hand shook so badly, the paper fluttered like a trapped bird. He can't do this. The judge ruled against him. It's over. It's never over with men like Vernon. Caleb's voice was tight with controlled fury. He's got money, connections, and nothing left to lose. Catherine's divorcing him, his inheritance is gone, his reputation is destroyed. Eli is the last card he can play. On what grounds? The judge saw through all his lies. Doesn't matter. Rich men can always find a judge willing to listen if they pay enough. Caleb crumpled the telegram in his fist. We need help. Real legal help. Mr. Garrett, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. I have a friend in Cheyenne. Practiced law for 30 years before retiring. If anyone can navigate this, it's him. I'll ride out this morning. You can't afford not to, Mr. Garrett said firmly. And don't worry about payment. That man owes me favors going back decades. He left within the hour. The ranch fell into anxious waiting, the joy of their recent victory curdling into fear. Lydia threw herself into work, as if keeping busy could somehow protect them. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, reorganized cupboards that didn't need it, baked enough bread to feed an army. Caleb worked himself to exhaustion, repairing fences that could have waited until spring, chopping enough firewood to last 3 winters. They moved around each other like ghosts, their new marriage already strained by the weight of what they might lose. On the 4th night, Lydia found Caleb in Eli's room, standing over the cradle with an expression of such raw anguish she felt her heart crack. I can't lose another son, he whispered. I won't survive it. Lydia crossed to him, took his hand. Then we fight. We fight with everything we have. What if everything isn't enough? She had no answer for that. So instead she pulled him close, and they stood together in the darkness, listening to their son breathe, trying to memorize the sound in case it was taken from them. Mr. Garrett returned a week later with a grim-faced man named Thomas Blackwell. The lawyer was in his 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who'd seen every trick the legal system had to offer and had counters for all of them. He spread papers across the kitchen table, his expression grave. Vernon Ashford is claiming the adoption was procured through fraud. He's arguing that Henry Patterson had no right to relinquish parental rights because the paternity was disputed. That you, Mr. Rourke, and Mrs. Rourke, knowingly participated in an illegal adoption to deprive him of his son. That's insane, Lydia said. The judge ruled Vernon had no legal standing in Cedar Ridge before a territorial judge with limited jurisdiction. Vernon's appealing to the federal circuit court in Denver. Different judge, different rules, and unfortunately, a judge who's known to be sympathetic to men of wealth and standing. Blackwell's tone was neutral, but his eyes were sympathetic. I won't lie to you. This is going to be difficult. What do we need to do? Caleb asked. We need to prove beyond any doubt that Vernon Ashford is unfit, that his claim is motivated purely by financial gain, and that removing Eli from your care would cause the child irreparable harm. Blackwell pulled out a notebook. I'll need statements from everyone who witnessed Clara's final days, medical testimony if we can get it, character witnesses for both of you, and we need to find every piece of dirt on Vernon we can. His treatment of Clara, his bigamy, anything that paints him as the villain he is. Catherine Ashford, Lydia said suddenly. She testified against him, and she said she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of man he was. She's already done more than that. Blackwell smiled grimly. Mrs. Ashford is a formidable woman with formidable connections. She's been systematically destroying her husband's reputation across Denver society. But we need her to testify again in federal court. That won't be easy. She's already filed for divorce and may want to distance herself from the whole mess. I'll write to her, Lydia said. Woman to woman. She lost Clara too, in a way. She'll understand what's at stake. Over the next weeks, they built their case like soldiers preparing for war. Margaret and James gave detailed statements about Clara's final days, her fear, her explicit wishes for Eli's future. Samuel and David testified to finding Henry and bringing him back, to his clear devastation and his reasoned decision to relinquish his rights. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, even Martha Kinsley, provided character references for Caleb and Lydia, describing the transformation of the ranch, the care given to travelers in need, the love so evident in their treatment of Eli. And Catherine Ashford, bless her, responded to Lydia's letter with a promise that made Lydia weep with relief. She would testify. She would bring evidence of Vernon's cruelty, his manipulation, his mercenary nature. She would do everything in her power to ensure that monster never got his hands on an innocent child. But as the court date approached, Vernon made his own preparations. Stories began circulating, whispered rumors about Lydia's barrenness, suggestions that a woman who couldn't bear children naturally was unfit to raise one. Implications that Caleb was mentally unstable after his family's death, that the ranch was failing, that Eli would be better off with a wealthy father who could provide every advantage. The rumors were poisonous, insidious, and they were working. Lydia could see it in the way some townspeople looked at her now, the way conversations stopped when she entered Morrison's store. The support that had seemed so solid was beginning to crack under Vernon's campaign of innuendo and lies. "He's trying to isolate us," Blackwell explained during one of his visits to the ranch. "Make you seem like desperate, unstable people who stole a child they had no right to. It's a classic strategy." "How do we counter it?" Caleb asked. "By being exactly what you are. Good people, good parents, building a good life." Blackwell looked around the kitchen, at the clean surfaces, the fresh curtains, the evidence of care and effort everywhere. "When we get to Denver, when you stand before that judge, let them see this. Let them see what you've built, not just the physical ranch, but the family, the love. That's what will win this case if anything can." The day came too quickly, and not quickly enough. They made the journey to Denver with Eli bundled against the November cold, Mr. Garrett and Blackwell accompanying them. Margaret and James stayed behind to mind the ranch, along with Samuel and David. The separation felt wrong, like leaving part of themselves behind. Denver was overwhelming after months of ranch isolation, crowded streets, noise, strangers everywhere. The federal courthouse was an imposing stone building that made Cedar Ridge's wooden structure look like a child's playhouse. Inside, the courtroom was paneled in dark wood, with high ceilings and windows that let in cold northern light. Vernon sat at the plaintiff's table with two lawyers, looking prosperous and confident. He'd recovered his composure since the Cedar Ridge defeat, had marshaled his resources and his rage into this new assault. When his eyes met Lydia's across the courtroom, she saw nothing but cold calculation. The judge was a man named Aldridge Pemberton, 60-something and distinguished, with the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. He looked at Eli with the distant interest one might give a piece of evidence rather than a living child. Vernon's lawyer stood first, painting a picture of a grieving father denied his rightful son by opportunistic strangers who'd taken advantage of a confused dying woman and a distraught young man. He described Vernon as a pillar of Denver society, a man of means and education who could provide opportunities the Rourkes never could. He glossed over the bigamy, calling it a misunderstanding, and dismissed Catherine's testimony as the bitter ravings of a scorned woman. "Mr. Ashford loved Clara deeply," the lawyer said, his voice oozing sincerity. "Their relationship was complicated, yes, but what relationship isn't? And when he learned of her death, when he discovered she'd borne a son, his only thought was to claim his child and provide him with the life Clara would have wanted. Instead, he was met with hostility, lies, and a conspiracy to keep him from his own flesh and blood." It was a masterful performance. Even knowing the truth, Lydia felt the insidious pull of the narrative. Vernon as victim, she and Caleb as villains who'd stolen a child for their own selfish purposes. Then Blackwell stood, and the temperature in the room changed. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has painted a pretty picture. Unfortunately for Mr. Ashford, pretty pictures tend to fade when exposed to harsh light, including Catherine Ashford, Vernon's legal wife, who has intimate knowledge of his character and motives." Catherine was called to the stand. She was magnificent, poised, credible, devastating. She described Vernon's cruelty in clinical detail, his obsession with wealth and status, his complete lack of genuine feeling for anyone, including herself. She produced letters Vernon had written to his lawyer, discussing how to acquire an heir by any means necessary. She painted a portrait of a man so mercenary, so fundamentally selfish, that the thought of him raising a child was obscene. Vernon's lawyers tried to discredit her, suggesting she was motivated by revenge. Catherine smiled coldly. "Revenge would be easier, gentlemen. I could simply take my half of our shared assets and walk away. Instead, I'm here because a 17-year-old girl died terrified and alone, and I will not allow her son to fall into the hands of the man who destroyed her." Next came Margaret, describing Clara's final days with quiet dignity. She repeated Clara's words about fearing Vernon, about wanting her son protected, about trusting Lydia with her most precious gift. She described the birth, the desperate fight to save Clara's life, the moment Clara made Lydia promise to raise Eli. Then Henry Patterson took the stand via written deposition. He'd refused to appear in person, but his testimony was powerful nonetheless. He described falling in love with Clara, learning about Vernon's deception, helping her escape. He detailed his decision to relinquish parental rights, explaining with raw honesty that he couldn't look at Eli without remembering Clara's death, but that he wanted his son raised by people strong enough to love him properly. Throughout it all, Vernon sat stone-faced, his lawyers whispering urgently in his ears, but Lydia could see cracks forming in his composure. He hadn't expected such a coordinated assault, such damning testimony. Finally, Blackwell called Lydia to the stand. She stood on shaking legs, crossed to the witness box, and placed her hand on the Bible. As she swore to tell the truth, she looked at Eli and Caleb's arms and felt strength flow through her. This was for him. All of this was for him. Mrs. Rourke, Blackwell began gently, please tell the court how you came to care for Clara in her final days. Lydia took a breath and began to speak. She described the storm, the desperate travelers, Clara's arrival with Henry. She described the difficult birth, the bleeding that wouldn't stop, the fever that followed. And she described Clara's final request, delivered with the clarity that sometimes comes before death. She grabbed my hand, Lydia said, her voice steady now, and she said, promise me you'll take my son, raise him, love him. She was terrified that Vernon would find him, that he'd use her baby like a piece of property. She didn't want wealth or status for Eli. She wanted love, protection, a real family. And what did you promise her? I promised I'd raise him as my own, that I'd protect him with everything I had, that he'd never want for love or safety. Lydia's eyes found Vernon's. And I keep my promises. Vernon's lawyer cross-examined her viciously, trying to establish that she'd manipulated a dying woman, that she'd wanted a child so desperately she'd taken advantage of tragic circumstances. But Lydia held firm, answering each accusation with calm truth. I wanted a child, yes. I'd lost that dream when my first husband died, but I didn't steal Eli. His mother gave him to me. His father, his real father, Henry, confirmed that gift. And every single day since, I've proven myself worthy of that trust. When Lydia stepped down, Caleb took the stand. He described his own losses, his grief after Sarah and Daniel died, his isolation and despair. Then he described Lydia's arrival, the slow transformation of the ranch and himself, and finally the choice to become Eli's father. I was dead inside before that boy came to us, Caleb said simply. Going through motions, waiting to finish dying, but when I held him, when I looked at his face, I remembered what it felt like to have purpose, to have someone depending on me, to have a reason to be better than I was. He looked directly at Judge Pemberton. Vernon Ashford sees Eli as a means to an end, a key to unlock money. I see him as my son, as the second chance I never thought I'd get. That's the difference between us. The testimony concluded. Judge Pemberton called for closing arguments. Vernon's lawyer made an impassioned plea about blood rights and paternal privilege, about the fundamental unfairness of allowing strangers to raise a man's biological son. Blackwell stood for the final time, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Your Honor, the law exists to protect the vulnerable, and there is no one more vulnerable than a child. Eli Rourke is 8 weeks old. He has known one home, 2 parents who love him without reservation, and a community that has rallied to protect him. Vernon Ashford is biologically his father. We cannot dispute that. But fatherhood is not merely biological. It's showing up. It's sacrifice. It's putting a child's welfare above your own desires. Vernon Ashford has done none of those things. He abandoned Eli's mother when she was pregnant and desperate. He only sought custody when money was involved. And he has demonstrated through every action that he sees this child as property, not as a person deserving of love and protection. Blackwell paused, letting his words sink in. The Rourkes, by contrast, have demonstrated exactly what parenthood should be. They took in a dying woman when they had no obligation to do so. They fought to save her life. They honored her final wishes. They legally adopted her son, and they have raised him with devotion and care. This court has the power to destroy that family, to traumatize a child by ripping him from the only parents he's ever known. And for what? So Vernon Ashford can claim an inheritance? So he can parade a son he doesn't love before judges and lawyers to prove his wealth and virility? That's not justice, Your Honor. That's cruelty dressed up in legal language. Judge Pemberton leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I'll take this matter under advisement. Court is adjourned pending my decision. The waiting was agony. They took a room at a modest Denver hotel, unable to stomach the journey back to the ranch until they knew Eli's fate. Days crawled past. Lydia barely slept, starting awake at every sound, convinced someone was coming to take her son. Caleb paced like a caged animal, his jaw tight with suppressed tension. On the fourth day, a messenger arrived. Judge Pemberton had reached his decision. They were to return to court immediately. The courtroom was packed, word had spread, and half of Denver society seemed determined to witness the outcome. Catherine Ashford was there, seated in the front row, her face a mask of composure that didn't quite hide her anxiety. Vernon sat rigid at his table, flanked by his lawyers, his expression hungry and expectant. Judge Pemberton entered, and the room fell silent. He took his seat, arranged papers before him, and looked out over the crowded courtroom. This has been one of the most difficult cases I've ever had to decide, he began. The law is clear in some respects and murky in others. Biological paternity carries weight. So does legal adoption. So does the wishes of a dying mother. So does the welfare of the child. Balancing all these considerations requires wisdom I'm not certain I possess. Lydia felt Caleb's hand find hers, gripping so tightly her bones ached. However, the judge continued, I am guided by a principle that supersedes all others, the best interest of the child. And after reviewing all testimony and evidence, I have reached a conclusion. The pause felt eternal. Vernon Ashford's paternity is established by blood and by circumstantial evidence. However, his conduct toward the child's mother was reprehensible. He entered into a fraudulent marriage with a minor, isolated her from her support system, and abandoned her when she became pregnant. His pursuit of custody is demonstrably motivated by financial gain rather than genuine paternal affection. Furthermore, his character as evidenced by multiple witnesses suggests he is temperamentally and morally unsuited to raise a child. Vernon's face went purple with rage, but his lawyer restrained him. By contrast, Caleb and Lydia Rourke have demonstrated exemplary character and genuine love for this child. They have provided him with a stable home, devoted care, and a community of support. The adoption, while complicated by disputed paternity, was executed in good faith based on the clear wishes of the child's mother and the legal relinquishment of the man she married. Judge Pemberton looked directly at Vernon. Mr. Ashford, you may be Eli's biological father, but you have forfeited any moral claim to that title through your actions. This court finds that removing Eli from the Rourke's care would cause irreparable harm to the child for no purpose other than satisfying your greed. He picked up his gavel. The adoption of Eli Rourke by Caleb and Lydia Rourke is hereby affirmed and made permanent. Vernon Ashford's petition for custody is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, Mr. Ashford is ordered to pay all court costs and is prohibited from any further contact with the child or the Rourke family. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. The gavel fell with the finality of a door slamming shut on Vernon's ambitions. The courtroom erupted. Catherine Ashford stood and applauded, tears streaming down her face. Blackwell shook Caleb's hand vigorously. Strangers who'd followed the case congratulated them, and Lydia collapsed into Caleb's arms, sobbing with relief so profound she couldn't speak. Vernon stood slowly, his face a mask of impotent fury. This isn't over. I'll appeal. I have resources. Mr. Ashford, Judge Pemberton said coldly, I suggest you accept this decision with what grace you can muster. Any further frivolous appeals will be met with sanctions. You've lost, permanently. Now leave this courtroom before I have you removed. Vernon's lawyers practically dragged him out, his threats echoing behind him. But they were empty now, the ravings of a defeated man. Catherine approached Lydia and Caleb, her composure finally breaking. Thank you for fighting for her, for making sure her son is loved. Thank you, Lydia said, embracing this woman who'd been both Vernon's victim and Clara's unexpected champion. For your courage. We couldn't have won without you. You would have, because you're his real parents. Catherine touched Eli's sleeping face gently. Be happy, all of you. That's the best revenge against men like Vernon, building something beautiful they can never touch. They left Denver the next morning, but not before receiving one final piece of news. A woman had arrived at their hotel late the previous night, travel-worn, anxious, introducing herself as Clara's sister from Chicago. She'd come as soon as she'd heard about the trial, desperate to see her nephew, to know he was safe. She spent an hour with them, holding Eli, crying over the sister she'd lost and the nephew she'd found. She gave them letters Clara had written years before, photographs, small remembrances. And when she left, she made Lydia promise to tell Eli about his mother, not just the tragedy of her death, but the joy of her life before Vernon destroyed it. Tell him Clara loved flowers and music, that she had the kindest heart, that she deserved so much better than what she got. The sister's voice broke. But mostly tell him that she loved him enough to find him the best parent she could, that her last act was one of hope, not despair. The journey home felt different, lighter despite the weight of all they'd been through. When they crested the final hill and saw the ranch spread out below them, smoke rising from the chimney, Margaret waving from the porch with Tommy and Beth beside her, Lydia felt something settle deep in her chest. This was home. Not the place she'd been exiled to, but the place she'd chosen, the place she'd fought for, the place where she belonged. Winter came hard that year, but the ranch was ready. They'd stored enough food, chopped enough wood, prepared for the isolation of deep snow. The little community that had formed around them, Margaret and James, Samuel and David, Mr. Garrett, stayed through the cold months, creating a family larger and stranger and more resilient than any of them had expected. On Christmas Eve, they gathered around a fire built high against the Wyoming cold. The children played with wooden toys Mr. Garrett had carved. James strummed an old guitar, leading them in songs that rang sweet and slightly off-key through the house. And Caleb and Lydia sat together, Eli sleeping in Lydia's arms, watching the people who'd become their tribe. "You ever think about how we got here?" Caleb asked softly. "All the pieces that had to fall into place?" "All the tragedies, you mean," Lydia said. "Thomas dying, Sarah and Daniel, Clara, all that loss and grief and pain." "Yeah, but also all the choices. You agreeing to come here even though it felt like exile. Me letting you stay even though I wanted to stay buried in my grief. Us opening our doors during that storm, fighting for Eli even when it seemed hopeless." Caleb's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Maybe the point isn't that bad things happen. Maybe it's what we choose to build from the rubble." Lydia looked down at Eli, his perfect face peaceful in sleep. In a few years, he'd be old enough to ask questions about where he came from, about the mother who'd loved him enough to let him go, and the father who'd fought so hard to use him. And Lydia would tell him the truth, all of it, the beautiful and the ugly, because he deserved to know his story. But she'd also tell him about the ranch that became a sanctuary, about the storm that brought strangers together, about the community that rallied to protect a child they barely knew, about two broken people who'd learned to be whole again through the simple act of showing up for each other, day after day, choice after choice. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, revealing the ranch's bones, stronger now, fortified by winter's test. The garden came back to life under Lydia's careful hands. The cattle, leaner but healthy, moved out to fresh pasture. And Eli, growing faster than seemed possible, began to smile and coo and reach for the world with tiny, grasping hands. News filtered through occasionally from the wider world. Catherine Ashford had successfully divorced Vernon, taking half his remaining assets and using them to establish a home for unwed mothers in Denver, named in Clara's honor. Vernon himself had disappeared, his inheritance lost, his reputation destroyed, last heard of working as a clerk in San Francisco under an assumed name. Henry Patterson sent a single letter, postmarked from Oregon. It was brief, asking only if Eli was happy and healthy, and if they would tell him that his birth father had loved him but hadn't been strong enough to stay. Lydia wrote back with the long, detailed description of their life, of Eli's first smile and his attempts to roll over and the way he gripped Caleb's finger like he'd never let go. She never heard from Henry again, but she hoped the letter had brought him some peace. Margaret and James decided to stay permanently, building a small cabin on the edge of the property. Their children and Eli would grow up together, creating bonds that would last lifetimes. Samuel and David purchased land adjacent to the ranch, starting their own operation with Caleb's guidance and support. Mr. Garrett stayed too, becoming the grandfather none of them had, the wise elder who told stories and settled disputes, and taught the children to whittle. What had started as exile had become a community. What had started as an arrangement had become a marriage based on genuine partnership and deepening love. And what had started as a desperate promise to a dying woman had become a family stronger than blood. One evening in late spring, Lydia stood in the garden watching Caleb play with Eli in the grass. The baby was 6 months old now, sitting up on his own, laughing at everything with the pure joy only babies possess. Caleb made silly faces, eliciting peals of laughter that carried across the valley like music. Martha Kinsley, of all people, had ridden out that afternoon to bring fabric Lydia had ordered. She stood beside Lydia now, watching the scene with an expression that might have been regret. "I was wrong about you," Martha said quietly. "When we sent you here, I thought we were solving a problem. Getting rid of a woman who made us uncomfortable because she reminded us of failure and loss." She paused. "I didn't realize we were giving you exactly what you needed, and what this place needed too." Lydia didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "You've built something beautiful here, Lydia, something real. That baby is lucky to have you." And Caleb, I haven't seen him smile like that since before Sarah died. You did that. You brought him back to the living. "We brought each other back," Lydia said softly. Martha nodded, watching Caleb lift Eli high, the baby shrieking with delighted terror. "Yes, I suppose you did." After Martha left, Lydia joined Caleb in the grass. He handed her Eli, who immediately grabbed for her hair, his new favorite game. They sat together in the warm spring sunshine, and Lydia felt a contentment so complete it was almost frightening. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked. "How Cedar Ridge thought they were punishing me by sending me here. How I thought my life was over because I couldn't have children, and Thomas died and I'd failed at my only purpose." She kissed Eli's soft head. "But they gave me everything. This place. You. Him. A second chance at a life I thought was finished. You gave yourself that second chance by being brave enough to start over, by refusing to let the world define you by what you'd lost." Caleb took her free hand. "You're the strongest person I know, Lydia Rourke." "Lydia Rourke," she repeated, still sometimes surprised by the name. "I like the sound of that." "Yeah?" "Yeah, it sounds like someone who belongs somewhere, who has a family, who has a future." As the sun set over the Wyoming hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they gathered their son and walked back to the house together. Inside, Margaret was starting supper. The children were setting the table with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and Mr. Garrett was teaching Samuel a complicated card game while David looked on and laughed. This was the life Clara had wanted for her son, not wealth or status or social standing, but this: love and safety and belonging, a place where he'd be valued for who he was, not what he represented. Parents who'd chosen him deliberately and would fight to keep him no matter what the world threw at them. Years would pass. Eli would grow from baby to boy to man, would learn the story of his origins and the sacrifices made for his future. He'd grow up surrounded by siblings, because Lydia and Caleb would eventually have 2 children of their own, proving that the body's failures are sometimes temporary and that love creates its own miracles. He'd take over the ranch one day, would expand it and make it prosper, would raise his own children in the same house where he'd been saved. But on this evening, as spring melted into summer and the ranch thrived around them, Eli was simply a baby being carried home by his mother, surrounded by people who loved him, walking into a future as bright and open as the Wyoming sky. Lydia paused on the porch, looked back at the valley, bathed in golden light, and allowed herself a moment of pure gratitude. The world had tried to break her, with Thomas's death, with Cedar Ridge's judgment, with Vernon's cruelty. But she'd survived every blow and had somehow emerged stronger. And standing here, with her husband's arm around her waist and her son sleeping against her shoulder, and the home she'd built spread out before her, Lydia understood something fundamental. The world doesn't hand you happiness. You forge it yourself, choice by choice, day by day, from whatever materials grief and chance provide. She'd been sent here as punishment and had turned it into paradise. She'd been told she was worthless and had proven her worth beyond measure. She'd been given a dying woman's desperate hope and had transformed it into a legacy of love that would echo through generations. The joke had been on Cedar Ridge all along. They'd thought they were discarding a woman nobody wanted. Instead, they'd planted a seed that would grow into something they could never have imagined. A family built not on blood or obligation, but on the radical choice to keep showing up, keep loving, keep fighting for what mattered. Caleb kissed the top of her head. Ready to go in? Lydia took one last look at the land that had become theirs, at the life they'd built from nothing but determination and hope. Yes. Let's go home. They walked inside together, closing the door on the Wyoming twilight, and stepped into the warmth of their crowded, chaotic, perfect life. Behind them, the ranch stood solid against the approaching night, a testament to survival, to second chances, to the stubborn human capacity to build joy from sorrow. And Eli Rourke, sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, would grow up knowing exactly what he was worth, not because of the fortune he'd been used to claim, not because of the blood that ran in his veins, but because two people who'd lost everything had looked at him and decided he was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth loving with every broken, mended piece of their hearts. That was the story Lydia would tell him someday. Not a fairy tale where everyone lived happily ever after without effort, but a true story where happiness was earned through courage, sacrifice, and the absolute refusal to let the world's cruelty have the final word. And in the end, that was the only story worth telling.